Okay, let's just clear something up. A few weeks ago, I uploaded this video and summed up my thoughts on Automobilista 2 after more than 12 months away. The only problem is, Reiza Studios went and released this at pretty much exactly the same time, rendering all of my observations on the physics completely irrelevant. Automobilista 2 version 1.3 is being heralded across sim racing, particularly those who are fans of the title, as a literal game changer of an update in terms of how the cars feel to drive and how a lot of the previous quirks which put a lot of people off, myself included, have now been fixed. No more sticky diff and no more Oversteer Simulator 2021, apparently. That previous video I made has since been taken down and might be considered to be a massive waste of time, but actually, it was a massive blessing in disguise. I logged so many laps in so many different car track combos, so I have a pretty good idea of what AMS2 used to feel like pre-update, fresh in my mind. And over the past week or so, I've gone back over the exact same car track combos, and maybe a few new ones too, to put together a direct comparison of the before and after. I'm not here to tell you whether Automobilista 2 is worth buying or not, I'll leave that decision up to you, but I am here to give you my best assessment on whether it's improving. And the biggest improvement? Well, it's the handling. You guys called it, and you were right. Although it still undeniably feels like Automobilista 2, it's definitely taken a step in the right direction. Of course, it varies from car to car, but AMS2 has always had a tendency to lean towards an oversteery driving feel, relying on you to balance the car throughout the corners with your throttle pedal and constant opposite lock corrections. Now, I don't think that's ever going to change, since it seems to be the philosophy that Reiza Studios are using to develop the Madness engine. AMS2 will always have this odd feel to it, but previously at times it was completely over the top and overdone, and felt as if all of the rotation was taking place behind you like a forklift or a shopping trolley. In version 1.3, that feeling's pretty much gone, which is awesome because previously that was my biggest complaint. Although still definitely king of the oversteer and rotation by pedal inputs, it's much more in line with what you'd expect coming from other sims. I now feel like I can trust the cars I'm driving once I wrap my head around them. I can actually push them and understand them so much more, instead of being terrified of it inexplicably snapping loose at any moment. I'm no longer constantly second guessing myself because I don't know whether the car's going to make the corner or not. And that is allowing me to become so much more immersed in the driving. Take for example the Super V8 car. Sure, I know it's a brute of a thing to drive at the best of times, but it used to feel like you had very little control over those rear tyres, even when you were babying the throttle and being as gentle as possible. Now? Well, it still slides around all over the place and is, in my opinion, way too much of a handful, but at least it's believable. It doesn't feel like the car's been difficult for the sake of being difficult. It feels like the car's been difficult because, well, it's got a lock diff and you've not been good enough with your inputs. It's now easier to feel the traction and it reacts in a much more planted way on the rear. It grips the road. Well, not much, but it does grip. More than before, at least. Another example of a big improvement is the Porsche GTE. The driving feel has been completely and utterly transformed, to the point where I actually didn't want to stop driving when my time was up, despite having lapped the Nordschleife who knows how many times before. It feels alive. No more holding on for dear life when you turn in and hang out the rear in the middle of the corner. It now hunkers down to the road instead of floating on top of it, and it gives you a proper feeling of weight through the steering wheel. Also, I don't know if this has always been there, but I absolutely love the way the air hose wobbles around rather comedically in the cockpit, depending on the G-forces. It's such a small detail, but these kind of things add up. Further reinforcing the improved handling is the DPI at, well, Daytona. It just feels so good, much tighter in the steering than before. Previously, the rear of the car was incredibly nervous, especially at lower speeds, which is quite apparent here with the majority of the corners being slow speed hairpins. Gone is that sensation that the car will snap should you crank on too much steering lock. The mechanical grip is now really nice and you can lean on the car. The front feels pointy, especially with the new force feedback tweaks. You can feel every bump in the road. On the banking when the tyres get loaded up, the car wants to throw you around and honestly, it's so much fun. I don't tend to use the word fun often, as I usually get lost in the chase for lap times when I go sim racing. Automobilista 2 has the ability to make you mentally take a step back from that and bask in the immersion with a massive smile on your face, thanks to the amazing visuals, especially in VR. It isn't all good news though, guys, but I'll get onto that later in the video. Moving on to some of the more high-powered cars really highlights the changes that AMS2 has gone through recently. That weird, over-rotatey, oversteery feeling is definitely gone in the higher-powered Formula cars, such as the McLaren F1 car from 1998 with that sneaky second brake pedal. And I felt like I could really manage that mid-corner grip so much better. Although it is a little odd how you can still apply more lock and get more steering out of the car, despite the front tyres being loaded up. Gotta be honest, understeer in AMS2 feels a little underpowered. Another great example of this was the Formula V12 car at Classic Hockenheim, where the apex curbs are really quite high and unsettle the car a lot. You want to get as close to them as possible, but not actually hit them. And I found this much easier in 1.3 compared to the previous versions, since I had a lot more fine control over the yaw of the car. Previously, it was a case of maintaining that turn and slide with the throttle, but now, yeah, it's hard to explain apart from describing it as much more natural, which is ridiculous really, as I've never driven a V12 powered Formula 1 car before. Even the Caterham 620R is better. I still don't like it, mind you, but at least I can see that it no longer suffers from the odd physics quirks of previous versions. I've tried this car on several occasions throughout the course of AMS2's development, and yeah, it still has the same characteristics of throttle equals rotation, but you know what? The car now actually noses in when you're off the throttle and turn the steering wheel. It's more than just a suggestion box attached to the dashboard. You've still got to be sidekick to get this thing around a lap though, knowing way in advance what direction you want to go in. Long before you even get to the corner, you're setting up the weight transfer, which makes reactive driving very difficult, and I just don't think I like it, no matter what they do with the physics. Something that has me stumped though is the Formula 3 car, because it kind of feels exactly the same. Ridiculous amounts of slip angle and slides that you just shouldn't be able to save, and a general feeling that the rear is way more lively than it ever would be in reality. Show me a clip of an actual Formula 3 car where someone managed to come back from something like this. I actually had a lot of hope for this car because, as fans of the channel will know, lower Formula single-seaters, they're my thing. Race Room's Formula 2 and Formula 3 cars, iRacing's Formula Renault 3.5 and Skip Barber's, Assetto Corsa's Tartar's FA01, and even R-Factor 2's USF 2000. I love them. I was so disappointed when I drove this F3 again in Automobilista 2 after the 1.3 update, as it just kind of felt like nothing's changed, it's still a drift car. Even the cars which feel worse to drive in 1.3 are still technically an improvement. The BMW Procar is now an understeering piece of garbage which hates turning in when you're on the brakes. One sniff of a lockup and you're missing the apex and sailing wide, so you really do have to be careful approaching a corner, but that's kinda how it should be. Previously you could be late on the brakes and still manage to throw it in with the front tyres squealing, and it was a bit, dare I say it, sim-cady. Now, despite it being a lot more frustrating, it's definitely more in line with what you'd expect coming from somewhere like, say, Race Room or iRacing, and it just makes it more believable and easier to trust. That said, the on-power oversteer seems a lot less manageable in this car now, much harder to modulate on the corner exit, and really highlights that classic AMS2 slidey rear feeling. Speaking of sliding around, what's the wet weather like? Well, it's good, actually. Really good. But then again, it's always been good. The transitions between dry and wet work really well. The track gradually forms puddles and gradually dries out over time, depending on where people actually drive. This is so cool when you're trying to stop your wet tyres from overheating on a drying track, as you have to go hunting for the parts of the track that's still wet, and the same in reverse. Walking that tightrope of the drying line on slick tyres is such a challenge, and every time you do another lap, the track's different. It's great. In the initial release, those transitions could come across a little bit scripted though, as the levels of grip could seem really inconsistent, almost like there was an invisible switch being flicked when the physics decided it was time to change from dry to wet, for example. Now, it's a much smoother and more fluid situation, pun 100% completely intended, and more recently in 1.3 that's been taken even further, as the rain really seems to affect the grip available, even just small amounts of rain. For one of my test races, I ran the BMW 2002 Turbo at Curvello and had a light sprinkle in the middle of the race. Nothing major, but enough to put the wipers on. Pre-update, it didn't seem to affect the handling or the lap times too much, but on 1.3, wow, you could really tell it was a slippy surface. Not like slippy as in spinning around all over the place, more like the car was sat on top of the water and breaking traction, sliding wide through the corner if you carried too much speed. I could really feel the rubber and the tyres not biting into the road. To test this out further, I dialed up the weather to full storm conditions and took the McLaren GT4 out for a spin, literally, at Kyalami, and immediately noticed two things. The wet weather driving is now much more treacherous, with the momentum being key to a good lap time. Overall grip has been massively reduced in the rain, so you need to avoid bogging the car down or spinning up the tyres at all costs. You can take some crazy lines which wouldn't normally be fast, but just seem to work and could literally be worth several seconds a lap. The other thing I noticed, puddles are nowhere near as deadly now. They'll still slow you down and pull you to one side if you're not careful, so it's still best to avoid them, but it's nowhere near the insta-bin scenario we had previously, which is fantastic. This is honestly some of the best dynamic track surface implementation I've experienced in any sim, including Assetto Corsa Competizione and rFactor 2. The grip just feels right in that there's a palpable loss of it once the track gets wet and that it's constantly changing. It doesn't just come across as an overall generic value being reduced in the physics engine. Another area that Automobilista 2 has some of the best implementation in any sim is the virtual reality. If you know this channel, you'll know that it's 99% about sim racing in VR. I mean, my channel picture is an Oculus Rift headset, come on, it's what I do. It's not just all about the amazing visuals though, you know, the superb lighting effects with sunbeams poking through the mist at sunrise at the Nordschleife, or even the way the night feels so incredibly immersive at Daytona with all of the trackside illumination right in your face. It's not even about the insane level of details such as individual blades of grass, bits of rubber falling off the tyres onto the track, wobbly air hoses, or raindrops on the windshield. It's about how you can have all of these details and crank up the super sampling and still maintain a decent frame rate. It's just optimized so well. I've often said that Assetto Corsa has some of the best VR out there, and I'll stick by that, but that depends a lot on mods and shader patches. In terms of a sim that you can just install and drive straight out of the box, nothing comes close to AMS2 visually in VR, and that's a massive selling point for me. It's made even sweeter by the way that this footage is shown on a desktop monitor too, which is how I record all of this onboard footage for you watching. The field of view is nice and wide, so it's not just a super zoomed in view of the dashboard like in Race Room. It's not warped like in rFactor 2, and the menus and the UI don't move around all over the place when I move my head like in iRacing or Assetto Corsa. That said, something which has definitely not been fixed since day one is the UI customization. The boxes to move different elements don't line up with the elements themselves, and they don't even line up with what you see in VR either. It's a bit of a mess. I normally get around this in other sims by using a program called SimHub to design my own overlays, tapping into the shared data that the sim has to offer, but in Automobilista 2, some of that data is a little bit lacking, so I can't display things like DRS, traction control, or ABS, and also the tyre wear and temperature seem to be a little bit off and don't quite match up sometimes. The menus and the UI in general in Automobilista 2 is a little bit clunky and, to say the least, difficult to navigate. It's easy to see that Reiza have picked up where Project Cars 2 left off, with many of the menus being carryovers from what Slightly Mad Studios did. It's always difficult taking over someone else's project, as you need to try and learn what they've done and then reverse engineer it instead of starting from scratch. But it kind of feels like AMS2 is the square peg in the round hole scenario here. Getting my wheel setup wasn't completely straightforward either. Granted, I'm running the relatively new Fanatec CSL DD, but none of the default profiles would recognize my input, so I had to create a new profile from scratch and remap everything, which I would have had to do anyway since the devs recommend deleting all your settings every time they drop a major update. Loading times are good though, much better than before. Even when I tried to stress it out with a full car grid at the Nordschleife, I didn't have time to go and do a quick grocery run like I would in a certain other unnamed sim. Sadly though, there is no improvement on the replay and camera system. Compared to day one, you can now actually save replays, but only in a race session, not practice. So for all of the action shots you've been seeing of cars running by themselves, I had to go and set up a one-car race. That just doesn't make sense. What really doesn't make sense though is the fact that you can't skip ahead in a replay. Instead, I had to fast forward through the whole thing and sit through this. I couldn't get creative either and position the camera where I wanted to because in Automobilista 2 there are no custom cameras. There's a photo mode, but that's just for taking screenshots, and that's extremely disappointing as a content creator. I want to make videos that look nice with great angles that really show off the cars or the tracks I'm talking about, especially Automobilista 2, which looks and runs so good. ACC looks good too, but it's quite hard to get stable frames out of it, whereas Race Room has a fantastic replay and camera system, but the graphics are getting a bit dated now. But wait, there's more. For all the positives that I've mentioned so far, there were several negatives that just kept on popping up, and they might seem quite minor or trivial, but these are the kind of things that break that immersion I was talking about earlier in the video. In most cars, the pedal and shifter positions don't line up with your driver. In the Super V8, your legs go straight through the seat. In the Fiat Uno, your hand is reaching for an invisible gear stick. In the pit stops, especially in open wheelers, the suspension bugs out and the car just jumps up and down on the spot. There's random walls dotted all around the place which don't have collision enabled, meaning you can just drive straight through them. The grass and the gravel has some kind of insta-spin physics involved. There is absolutely no grip out there. Sure, I know that anything other than tarmac isn't a slick tie's best friend, but this effect is so over the top, it's ridiculous. That said, I couldn't get the Indy car, or any car actually, to do burnouts. First gear, clutch in, no assist enabled, and full throttle with maximum lock, and it'd manage 180 degrees before the tyres gripped up and stopped the slide dead in its tracks. I also found no discernible difference on the traction control settings on the DPI car either. Whether it was TC0 or TC10, there was no difference in how lively the rear of the car was. Maybe the biggest issue I found though was the force feedback changes. Don't get me wrong, on the whole it feels great now, especially on the new Default Plus profile, which was made with the help of the AMS2 community and their own custom profiles, by the way. But when you get into a slide, the wheel pulls violently and all the forces load up massively, way stronger than any of the other forces you feel throughout the rest of the lap, even at high speed with full aerodynamics loading up. Yeah, I know you're meant to let go of the wheel during a crash, but a snap of oversteer seems a little bit dramatic to be just taking your hands off the controls completely. I'm running the Fanatec CSL DD with the 8Nm boost kit, running the force feedback any lower, and I found that I lost so much detail when driving around the rest of the lap, so to me it kind of seems like there's something not quite right here. Something else on the force feedback I noticed was that when I got to maximum steering rotation in the car, I'd get these big oscillations in the wheel, like there was a rubber band instead of a dead stop at the full lock. But that's not what happened here though. I honestly have no idea what the hell happened here. I was just sat on the grid minding my own business and then had massive vibrations, literally shaking bolts out of the rig, which I could only stop by physically removing the power supply from the wheel. Fanatec don't sell emergency stop buttons for the CSL DD because this kind of thing shouldn't happen. And who knows what other bugs might be lurking once you scratch the surface a little bit deeper, but the problem is, you only find out when you're halfway through a race and you can't do anything about it. But surely the AI is improved by now though, right? No. Not really. If you're looking for a good single-player offline experience, then Automobilista 2 isn't the right sim for you. It's a shame because the original Automobilista was fantastic, but it seems like the limitations that Project Cars encountered with this Madness engine are just part of the package that Reiza have inherited as well. At no point during any of my test races did I find myself racing the AI. I found myself driving around them. Some corners they'd be ridiculously slow, whereas others they could just drive right around the outside of me. There was no satisfaction in making an overtake because it only felt like I got the place because the AI were crap in that particular corner. And when I get overtaken, it wasn't because I'd stuffed up, it was because they had suddenly had unholy levels of grip compared to my car. The AI wasn't predictable, the AI wasn't consistent, and the AI was definitely not on the same version of the physics that I was. I could be sliding all over the place, struggling for grip, and with the slightest of contact or wheel on the grass, I'd be losing control, but the AI would be completely on rails. punting each other all over the place, off the track, kicking up dirt, and they'd have no problems whatsoever. It's not a believable experience at all, and I find myself making so much unexpected car contact and having to drive so ridiculously carefully around them because they just do stupid things. Even with the aggression dialed all the way down, it was like I was target practice in the Max Verstappen training academy. If racing driver gap and all that. It doesn't matter how much the physics and the handling improves if you can't have a good racing experience. This is a racing simulator after all, not a driving simulator. But that's the beauty of racing online, and this is something that Reiza Studios have absolutely nailed. When you take to the multiplayer servers, you bypass the need to share the track with the terrible AI. Instead, you're wheel to wheel with other humans who are running exactly the same physics as you, dealing with exactly the same track surface and temperatures as you, and suffering with the tire wear and fuel burn exactly the same as you. It's also so easy to set up a server in AMS2, no need for dedicated hosting. It's all done through the in-game menus, and when you get into the session, the ping and synchronization handling is superb as well. Cars don't warp around or, like in iRacing, temporarily disappear from existence completely. Even if there is a slight synchronization issue, ghosting becomes enabled to avoid any potential contact and netcode dramas. I mean, how good is that? Honestly, in my opinion, multiplayer is where it's at in Automobilista 2. If you can find yourself a group of people to race with or a league to join, do it. Do it now. You're not going to regret it. I also can't wait to see what the new online competition ranking system is going to be like over the next few months. If the player base is there, then the potential to just be able to jump in and out of official servers and go racing with a scoring system and points on the line is super exciting. RaceRoom's ranked servers really brought RaceRoom into the spotlight over the last couple of years, despite participation being heavily based in the EU region, and I see no reason why AMS2 can't experience a similar growth if Reiza Studios get it right. And last but not least, something that they've very much been getting right so far is the addition of new content. There's always been a roadmap in place for new cars and new tracks, with monthly updates from devs on the forums as well, but the sheer rate of development has been absolutely staggering. Say hello to the Nordschleife, Bathurst, Spa-Francorchamps, Monza, Watkins Glen, Daytona, and that's just a few of the circuits. In terms of cars, we've now got GT1s, GT3s, GTEs, Group Cs, the BMW M1 Procar, classic Indy cars, the 1998 McLaren F1 car with the sneaky extra brake pedal, which is actually mappable and usable by the way. And this doesn't include the existing roster of cars, which is massive and includes things like modern Formula 1 cars, classic Formula 1 cars, vintage Formula 1 cars, V8 supercars, Le Mans prototypes, Brazilian stock cars, street cars, old bangers, go-karts, and of course, trucks. And honestly, that's not even half of it. In the past, Reiza Studios have always been about the Brazilian racing scene because that's where they're based. But that's also kind of been a limiting factor in terms of reaching out to a wider sim racing audience. It's an amazing breath of fresh air to be able to blast around some relatively unknown South American circuit in Rubens Barrichello's iconic stock car, but, and it pains me to say this, the masses are drawn to things like GT3s at Monza, Silverstone and Spa. Even if Automobilista 2's GT3s aren't exactly great. What is great though is Reiza's commitment to historic content. With most of the new circuits available, there's multiple older layouts to choose from too, so if you want to load up classic Formula 1s and race around a historically accurate version of Hockenheim or Silverstone, then you can, and it's fantastic, especially now that you can modify the AI names and characteristics and even add in custom skins. Being able to recreate the days of my childhood in Jeff Cromman's Grand Prix with modern day visuals in VR is honestly something I could never have dreamed of a few years ago. Automobilista 2 really is something special. So then, in summary, over the past year or so, Automobilista 2 has had a lot of new cars and tracks added. Multiplayer has become much more fleshed out and easier to use. It still looks stunning and runs so smoothly at high graphical settings, and a lot of the rough edges have been smoothed out as well. However, although you can't deny it's better than it was before, Automobilista 2 still has an excessively oversteery driving feel compared to every other sim, still gives you no confidence when racing against the AI, and still has the ability to pull you out of the immersion with a a random bug or glitch that just comes out of nowhere. My main sim and reference point for the last few years has been Race Room, and although Automobilista 2 appeals to me greatly in terms of weather, day-night, graphics, VR performance, load times, online stability, and probably many more things that I've forgotten about right now that I could only dream of in Race Room, I keep on getting drawn back to the driving feel. It's certainly improving, taking a particularly big step forwards in the 1.3 update, and I can see myself spending much more time in AMS2 than ever before, but it still just lacks that certain something. I don't find myself getting as invested in the whole experience as I do in other sims. It has so much potential, but despite flashes of absolute brilliance, once you add in the AI woes and the random bugs, 1 year on, and I'm still left with this frustrating feeling that it just isn't quite finished. So, to answer the question, is Automobilista 2 improving? Yes. But it's still got quite a ways to go before it becomes top tier yet. Anyway, I'd love to know what you think. Have I got it right, or have I got it wrong? Let me know in the comments below. What I do know is that I've got a few rather special Automobilista 2 events coming up on the channel over the next few months. So if you want to see those, maybe consider subscribing to the channel and pressing that notification bell. Until then though, you look after yourselves, and thanks for watching.